It was just after 3 in the morning when the call came through. I'd been a paramedic for almost 15 years by then, and I'd learned that most emergencies at that hour are either quiet tragedies or chaos wrapped in silence. That night, it was both. The dispatcher's voice was calm but tight. Cardiac arrest, residential address, outskirts of Phoenix. Family on scene. Nothing unusual, but something in her tone, something in the way she paused between words, told me this one would be different. My partner Jake was driving. The streets were empty, slick from a light rain that had passed an hour earlier. The siren's red glow reflected off puddles, like veins of light stretching through the darkness. I remember staring out the window, half awake, half on autopilot, until I realized how quiet it was. No traffic, no wind, just that hollow siren echoing through the night. When we arrived, the house stood alone at the end of a cul-de-sac, its porch light flickering faintly. A woman met us at the door, her eyes wide with panic but no tears. "He's not breathing," she whispered, as if afraid to say it louder. We followed her into the living room, where a man, mid-40s, maybe 50, lay motionless on the carpet. His name, I later learned, was David Miller. I dropped to my knees beside him, checked for a pulse. Nothing. Jake set up the defibrillator while I started compressions. Standard rhythm. Standard procedure. My hands moved automatically, but something felt off. The air in that room. It wasn't just grief or fear. It was heavy, almost electric. The family stood frozen, their faces pale, their eyes darting not at me, but toward the hallway behind them, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "Charging," Jake said. The defibrillator's rising tone filled the silence. I glanced at the monitor. Flatline. "Clear." A jolt. David's body jerked violently, then went still again. I resumed compressions. We repeated the process, one shock after another, watching for the slightest flicker of life. The wife clutched her hands so tight I thought she'd draw blood. I've worked hundreds of arrests. You learn to separate emotion from action. But as the minutes ticked by, I could feel something gnawing at me. A quiet whisper in the back of my mind, telling me this wasn't going to end like the others. The air grew colder. My breath began to fog. I remember glancing toward the thermostat. It read 61 degrees, far too cold for a running furnace. We pushed on. Oxygen, IV line, epinephrine. Repeat. Every move textbook perfect. Yet it felt like we were fighting something we couldn't see, as if the air itself resisted our efforts. Then, as Jake prepped another dose, I caught something strange. A faint movement in David's chest, not from compressions. Something different, like a reflex or a shiver. His eyelids fluttered for a second, then stilled. "Did you see that?" I asked. Jake looked at me like I'd imagined it. Maybe I had. Maybe exhaustion was getting to me. Time blurred after that. The monitor beeped erratically. Lights from our gear, casting soft blue shadows on the walls. Outside, the rain began again. Slow, rhythmic, almost matching the beat of my compressions. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room, the creak of floorboards as someone stepped back. It was the kind of quiet that felt alive. When I looked up, the family was praying. I remember thinking, they've already accepted he's gone. But I hadn't. Not yet. Something inside me refused to stop. I couldn't explain why, but in that moment, I knew this wasn't just another call. This was the one I'd remember for the rest of my life. And I was right. Because what happened next still haunts me to this day. The next few minutes became a blur of motion, the kind only paramedics understand. Once you begin resuscitation, there's no room for hesitation, no space for fear. Every movement, every breath, every jolt of electricity carries the fragile possibility of life. "Epi's in," Jake said, his voice steady but low. I nodded, focusing on the compressions, counting under my breath. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rhythmic push of my palms echoed through the quiet house. David's body moved with each thrust, his head rolling slightly to one side. The monitor stayed flat, an unbroken line of nothingness. "Charging again," Jake warned. The defibrillator's whine rose, sharp and metallic. "Clear!" Another jolt. David's chest lifted violently, then fell limp. I waited for the rhythm to return. Nothing, just the steady beeping of time running out. I checked his airway, repositioned the mask, adjusted the oxygen flow. We were doing everything right, exactly by protocol. But something was wrong. I could feel it. Not medically, not physically. Something in the air, an undercurrent of dread that made the hair on my arms stand up beneath my gloves. Jake broke the silence first. "Feels weird in here, doesn't it?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer. Paramedics don't entertain weird. We trust vitals, not feelings. But I felt it too, the unnatural chill, the heaviness pressing down on my chest like the air itself was watching us. Then came the first anomaly. David's body twitched, not from compressions or defibrillation, but on its own. A sharp, involuntary jerk that stopped us both. The monitor still flatlined. Yet his chest rose slightly, like a breath. "Did you see that?" Jake whispered. I hesitated, my hands frozen midair. "Could be a muscle spasm," I said, though my voice wavered. He nodded, pretending to believe it. We resumed. Seconds later, it happened again, this time unmistakably. David's eyes flickered open for the briefest moment, the pupils dilated, the whites glassy. His mouth moved slightly, just enough to form a sound, a whisper. A single, unintelligible word slipped out, faint but real. Jake stopped compressions. What did he just... Keep going, I snapped, more out of fear than authority. We returned to the rhythm, pretending we hadn't seen it, pretending that dead men don't speak. My mind raced for explanations. Postmortem reflexes, residual nerve firing, hypoxia-induced twitching. Logical things, science-based things. But none of them matched what we'd seen. That whisper wasn't air escaping, it was intent. After 12 minutes, we loaded him into the ambulance. The family's sobs faded as the door shut, sealing us in a cocoon of sterile light and humming machines. I climbed into the back, continuing compressions while Jake drove. The siren wailed through the empty streets, its pitch rising and falling like a heartbeat that refused to quit. The monitor flickered again, not with rhythm, but static. A quick burst of interference. Then nothing. I could feel sweat running down my neck, mixing with the cold air that somehow felt even colder inside the ambulance than outside. Come on, David, I muttered. Stay with us. And then, another breath, shallow and possibly faint. His chest lifted once, his lips parting as if to speak again. But the sound that came out wasn't air or a voice. It was something else. A whisper so soft I couldn't tell if I heard it with my ears or in my head. That was the first moment I felt it. The sense that we weren't just fighting for a life. We were fighting against something unseen, something that didn't want to let him go. Time no longer felt linear. It stretched, warped, blurred into something endless. By the 37th minute, my arms ached, my shirt clung to my back, and every push on David's chest felt like striking stone. But I couldn't stop, not yet. Something deep inside told me to keep going, though I didn't know why. Mark, Jake said, his voice low, exhausted. We're past the window. He was right. We were well beyond the golden 30 minutes. The odds were gone. But I couldn't let go. Something in David's face seemed unfinished, as if he was still trying to say something. I looked at the monitor again, flatline, no movement. The quiet whine of medical equipment filled the space, constant and unrelenting. The smell of antiseptic and sweat mixed with something metallic, faint but distinct. Outside, through the frosted ambulance windows, the streetlights blurred into ghostly orbs of orange light. And then the air shifted. It wasn't dramatic, but I felt it instantly. The cold deepened, seeping through my gloves. The fluorescent light above flickered, just once, but enough to draw our eyes upward. The silence after the flicker was heavy, oppressive. Jake froze mid-action. Did you feel that? He murmured. Before I could answer, every monitor froze. Every number, every reading locked in place like time itself had halted. The heart monitor, still connected to David, pulsed once with a blip of static, then went dark. System glitch, I said automatically, though my voice barely sounded like my own. Jake tapped the side of the monitor. Nothing. The screen was black. For a moment, the only sound was our breathing. Then, just as I turned to call time of death, David exhaled. It wasn't the passive release of air you expect when the body lets go. It was deliberate. A sound forced through his throat, like someone trying to form a word. His head tilted slightly toward me. His eyes opened. They weren't the glazed, lifeless eyes I'd seen 100 times before. They were focused, unfocused, both, like he was looking through me, not at me. His lips parted again. Jake stumbled back, muttering, Jesus Christ. Don't... The word barely escaped David's lips, hoarse and broken. Then 2 more words, barely audible. Let him in. The voice didn't sound like it came from a dying man. It was human, yes, but layered with something else, something that didn't belong in that room. I froze, my hand still on his chest. For the first time in years, I felt genuine fear, the kind that bypasses logic and burrows straight into instinct. My pulse pounded in my ears, and then nothing. The life drained from his face. His mouth fell open slightly. The line on the monitor, which had somehow flickered back on, stretched into one clean, unbroken tone. Jake stared at me, his voice barely a whisper. What the hell was that? I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just looked down at David, at the man who had somehow spoken after death, and knew that whatever I had just witnessed wasn't in any manual, any training, or any medical reality I'd ever known. As we zipped the body bag, I couldn't stop replaying the sound of his voice. Don't let him in. The words stuck to the air, heavy and electric, as if they were meant for me. That was the moment everything stopped. Not just for David Miller, but for me too. Because in that instant, I realized I'd crossed into something I could never unsee, something I could never unfeel. The ride back to the hospital was silent. The wail of the siren, usually a background rhythm I barely noticed, felt wrong that night, hollow. Each pulse of red light inside the cabin painted David's covered body in quick flashes, as if time were stuttering. Jake sat across from me, staring out the back doors, his face pale and unreadable. No one spoke. We didn't even acknowledge what we'd seen. But in that silence, something had changed. The air inside the ambulance felt heavy, like we'd brought something back with us, something we didn't understand. When we rolled into the ER bay, the triage nurse met us with a clipboard and a tired expression. "Another cardiac?" she asked. I nodded, handing her the chart. My voice came out lower than I intended, pronounced at 0342. But as I turned back toward the stretcher, I froze. The monitor that had gone completely dead during transport was on again, faintly flickering. The power light blinked once, twice, and then stabilized. Heart rate, 0. But the display was active. Jake caught my eye. Neither of us said anything. We both knew that machine wasn't supposed to restart on its own. After we handed the body over to the morgue techs, I went to the locker room, washed my hands, and tried to breathe. But even under the hum of fluorescent lights and the sting of antiseptic soap, I couldn't shake it. The cold, the words, that voice, "Don't let him in." I replayed them in my mind until they felt carved into my skull. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. Not desperate, not confused. It sounded like a warning. The hospital corridors were quiet at that hour. Long, sterile hallways bathed in dim yellow light. Every echo of my boots against the tile made me tense. I passed the empty trauma bays, the still monitors, the storage closet at the end of the hall, and then I heard it. A faint, single exhale. Just behind me, I spun around. Nothing. The hallway was empty. The sound wasn't imagined. I knew that tone, that breath. It was David's. I stood frozen for a full minute before forcing myself to keep walking. My pulse was still racing when I reached the exit. When I got to my car, the clock on the dashboard read 03.42, the exact time I'd pronounced him. The numbers glowed faintly red in the dark. I stared at them until my reflection blurred in the glass. For the first time in years, I didn't drive straight home. I just sat there in the hospital parking lot, engine off, hands shaking. And for a moment, in the quiet between the hum of the lights and my own breath, I swore I heard it again. A whisper from the back seat, "Don't let him in." For the next few nights, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear that same whisper, the same exact tone replaying in the darkness. My wife noticed. She said I looked pale, distracted. I told her it was just another tough call, but the truth was, I'd handled death for years, countless times, and never brought it home like this. Something about David Miller wouldn't let go. By the fourth night, I gave in to the obsession. I went back to the station after hours and pulled the case report from the digital log. Everything was by the book. Vitals, timestamps, medication doses, shock cycles, nothing out of order, except the timestamp on the heart monitor. It recorded electrical activity for 38 seconds after the time of death had been officially called. That was impossible. At first, I thought it was a glitch, a sync error between the device and the system clock. But when I checked the ambulance data logs, everything else lined up perfectly. Only David's file showed that anomaly. I couldn't shake the feeling that David's warning, "Don't let him in," meant something more than panic or delirium. It replayed in my head every time I sat behind the wheel of the ambulance, the way he'd look directly at me when he said it, like it wasn't meant for his family or anyone else in the room, only me. That night, I went back into the archives again. I searched David Miller's emergency history, tracing every paramedic dispatch tied to his address. There were 3. The first one was 2 years ago, a near drowning. The second, a massive arrhythmia last fall. And then, ours. But it was the second call that stopped me cold. The incident report had a strange notation under patient statements. I opened the transcript of the recorded dispatch. My hands started trembling halfway through. Before he collapsed that night, David had said 5 words to the 911 operator. "He's here again. He's waiting." It matched almost perfectly with what his wife had told me. I sat there in the dark corner of the station, the glow of the monitor lighting my face, realizing this wasn't an isolated event. This was a man who'd somehow known every time his heart would fail, and who believed something was coming for him when it did. The next day, I drove back to see Susan. I showed her the transcript. Her eyes filled with tears. "He used to wake up at night," she whispered, saying he could feel someone standing in the hallway. Said if he looked, he'd never wake up again. The next morning, I called Dr. Harris, the attending ER physician that night. He sounded tired, skeptical. "Mark, sometimes the monitors lag," he said. "Doesn't mean anything." "Except the monitor was off," I told him. "It came back online by itself." There was a pause, a long one. Then his voice dropped. "You're not the first paramedic to tell me that this year." My stomach tightened. Dr. Harris agreed to meet me in person. In his office, he showed me David's hospital record. "We treated him twice before this," he said, sliding a file across the desk. "Cardiac arrest both times. No lasting damage, but..." He hesitated. "He said something strange when he woke up." "What?" I asked. Harris exhaled. "He said he saw someone waiting for him, a man in the dark, and that he wasn't ready to go yet." I stared at the photo clipped to the file. David smiling with his wife and 2 kids, a normal suburban family. Nothing about him suggested a man haunted by anything. But written in the physician's notes, clear as day, were David's own words. He said he'd come back for me. That's when the pieces started to shift. I drove to the address on record, a modest home on the edge of Phoenix. His wife, Susan, opened the door with red eyes that told me she hadn't slept much either. When I introduced myself, she seemed relieved. You were with him that night, weren't you? I nodded. She invited me in. The living room was the same one I remembered. Still neat, still quiet, except for the faint hum of a fish tank in the corner. On the mantel was a framed photo of David, taken just weeks before his death. He used to talk about it, she said softly, about how he could feel it coming. Said there was someone he saw every time his heart stopped. Someone standing just out of reach. Her voice broke. He said next time, he wouldn't get away. For the first time since that night, I felt the hairs on my arms rise again. This wasn't just a glitch or coincidence. Whatever David Miller saw, whatever he was warning me about, he'd been running from it long before I ever arrived. Her words hit me harder than I expected. Back in the ambulance bay, I sat for a long time, staring at the medical bag between my feet, the same one I'd used that night. I've spent my whole career grounded in physiology, adrenaline, and routine. I've seen hearts restart, pulses vanish, breath return. But that night shattered the one rule I always counted on, that life and death are separate, measurable things. The truth is, paramedics live right on that border, between the living and the gone. Sometimes we cross it for just a few seconds, pulling someone back, like reeling a ghost from deep water. But sometimes, something crosses the other way, and that's the part no one ever trains you for. I started replaying every strange call I'd ever had. The faint smiles on patients moments before their last breath, the sudden drops in room temperature, the whispering monitors that flickered with heartbeats long after the body had cooled. I'd always dismissed them as coincidences, random noise in the chaos of medicine. But after David, they didn't feel random anymore. When people ask what keeps me up at night, it's not the blood, or the trauma, or the chaos. It's the silence. That exact kind of silence we heard in David Miller's living room. The kind that feels like someone or something is holding its breath, waiting to see what happens next. And sometimes, I swear, I still hear his voice. Dawn always has a strange kind of mercy. It softens everything. The edges of buildings, the weight of the night, even the memories that refuse to fade. I remember one morning, months after David Miller's call, parking the ambulance on a hill overlooking the city. The skyline glowed faintly gold, and for the first time in weeks, the world felt almost quiet. But silence isn't always peace. Sometimes it's just the space where echoes live. That night, his voice, that warning, never really left me. I still hear it, sometimes right before I fall asleep. Not like a haunting, not even like a sound. More like a memory that keeps breathing. And maybe that's what unsettles me most. That I don't fear it anymore, I just... Listen, in the years since, I've seen hundreds of calls blur together. Chaos, heartbreak, miracles. I've learned to let go of most of them, to file each night into its own folder in my mind and move on. But David's case doesn't fit in any of those folders. It's the one that taught me something medicine never could. That there's a line between life and death, and it isn't as clear as we like to think. Sometimes we don't cross it. Sometimes it crosses us. I used to believe my job was about saving lives. Numbers, stats, survival rates. But the longer I do this, the more I realize it's about witnessing life. Those final words. The look in someone's eyes. The breath that lingers when it shouldn't. Paramedics see humanity at its most fragile and its most profound. We stand beside the living as they fade, and sometimes beside the dead who still seem to hold on. When I think of David now, I don't picture the moment he flatlined or the confusion that followed. I remember his wife holding his hand, whispering that it was okay to let go. I remember the look on his face. Peaceful, as if he knew something I didn't. Maybe he did. People ask if I believe in the afterlife. I don't know how to answer that. What I believe in now is the moment. That sliver of time between the last heartbeat and whatever comes next. Because I've seen something there. Something real. Something impossible to name. As the sun broke through that morning, I stepped out of the ambulance and watched the city come alive again. The world moved on, as it always does. But I stood there for a while, just breathing, knowing I'd carry that night with me forever. Some cases change how you work. Others change how you see. And a few, the rare, unexplained ones, change how you understand life itself. Maybe that's what David meant all along. Don't let him in. Maybe he wasn't warning me about death. Maybe he was reminding me to respect it.